Thank you all for joining us. We're going to get started here in just about 4 more minutes. So thank you for your patience. Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Ask an Expert, Licensing, Permissions, and Requirements for Livestream and Rebroadcast, a Deeper Dive. My name is Caitlin Zachary, and I'm the Manager of Programs and Resources at the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. Before we get started, let's review a few technical items to ensure that everyone is properly set up to participate. Closed captioning for this webinar is available by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of the Zoom window as indicated. I would like to acknowledge that today we are meeting on a platform called Zoom that is headquartered in San Jose and on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Ramaytush and Muwekma Ohlone people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I would like to pay my respect to the Ramaytush and Muwekma Ohlone elders, both past and present. Our partners at Folk Alliance International will be adding resource links to the chat during this conversation. You can also refer to their website, folk.org or apap365.org for previous webinars in this Ask an Expert live streaming series. In addition to the Zoom platform, we are also broadcasting today's webinar on Facebook Live. Our panelists will be responding to pre-selected questions, as well as a few selected questions from the audience. If you do have questions for our panelists, we ask that you submit them using the Q&A box. If you have comments or questions you'd like to send to us privately, you can utilize the chat box. Make sure you select all panelists in the Send To drop-down menu. Today's webinar is being brought to you by the Alliance of Performing Arts Conferences. This group consists of representatives from the nation's regional performing arts conferences. The organization meets annually to discuss trends in the field and identify common areas of improvement. Since early March, APAC has been working closely together to provide up-to-date content related to the COVID-19 crisis and ideas for solutions to our various constituencies. You can refer to the websites of these organizations for up-to-date content and resources for the performing arts field. It is my pleasure to introduce the host and moderator for today's webinar, Renee Bodie. Currently, Renee is the general manager at Soka Performing Arts Center. Renee is the former president of Folk Alliance International, and in her time in this role, she negotiated performance rights organizations agreements between ASCAP and BMI on behalf of the membership. She strengthened relationships between PROs and artists by addressing song licensing and royalty payment concerns with folk artists and venues. Renee, thank you so much for leading us in this discussion. I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Well, the shuttering of venues due to COVID-19 has created the need to keep the arts accessible in new ways, and live streaming and rebroadcast of previously recorded shows has definitely come to the forefront. While not a new platform, utilizing the internet as a primary avenue is new for live venues. We are here today to clear up the legal issues and get to the nuts and bolts of licensing for live streaming and rebroadcast. We will cover who we need to get permissions from, what licenses are required, and how to obtain those licenses. And once those licenses are obtained, how do we inform the platform that we have the correct licenses so we don't get shut down by the algorithms? So we are going to jump right into this and hear first from John Johnston, Senior Vice President of Licensing at ASCAP. John has 29 years of experience in performance rights. 25 of those years are with ASCAP. So welcome, John, and thank you for joining us this morning. The first question we have is, what types of licenses are required for live stream and rebroadcast of previously recorded performances, and what are the differences between the two?
Okay. Thank you, Renee, and thank you, APAC, for putting us together. First of all, I just want to say I think this is awesome what you guys are doing and helping to educate folks as to these issues, because it can be. I understand with the challenges of what we've all had to go through this year with COVID. That navigating this landscape is new for a lot of folks, and this is challenging. To answer your question, as far as what types of licenses. It really goes right to how you're going to be using music. First and foremost, there's going to be a performance. And when you are live streaming, that is considered a performance, a public performance. So therefore, you're going to need the permission from the copyright owners for that public performance. And you can obtain that most readily and easily from the performing rights organizations such as ASCAP. If it's a rebroadcast, then in addition to the public performance right, you're also going to need to be able to obtain the rights to make a copy, a mechanical license, and that would be obtained from the publisher. So.
Thank you so much. So now that we know the type of license, how do you obtain the proper license? What is the procedure that a venue would need to go to, and who do they go to get those licenses?
Yeah, certainly. As I said, for the public performance rights license, you typically go to the performing rights organizations. So in our case, you would come to ASCAP, and the easiest way to do that is just to come right to our website. We have a form there to complete that will help you navigate through that, and then to obtain information depending on how you're using music. And then for the rebroadcast, as I said, then you'll need to obtain those rights from the publishers, either the mechanical or the synchronization, either one. In order to obtain that information as to who is publishing those works, you can use our website in order to look up a work and obtain that publisher information, and then navigate to, they'll help you get in touch with them.
Okay, so you've talked about, can you speak a little bit about the difference between a sync, when you're going to need a sync license? We know about live performance, obviously. I think that's, you know, kind of a given, but what is the difference between when you need a sync license and a mechanical license?
You know, there's probably other panelists on here that will speak to that a little bit more in depth than what I will, but you know, in short, is a sync license is really if you're going to have some type of video that's going to be synchronized to it. If it's an audio only file, that's just going to be straight up mechanical. If there's going to be some type of video to go along with that audio, then you're going to be talking about a synchronization.
Great. Okay. So one last question. We know that there are quite a number of PROs that we need to get these licenses from. Is there any way to streamline that process, or do we actually have to go to each, to ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, SOCAN, et cetera, to get each individual license?
You know, that again depends on what music you're going to be using. Obviously, if you're going to be limiting your performances to a specific repertory, you may be able to streamline that down to one or two PROs, ASCAP or BMI, or both. If you're going to be using music that is not in the repertory of ASCAP or BMI, you may need to go to a third PRO or to a fourth PRO, depending on what you're going to be doing.
Great. And would you, well, we can talk to David Hirshland is up next. We can talk to him about how we find that out.
Hey, Renee, do you mind if I interrupt for a moment?
Please.
I had a question for John, and I wanted to sort of clarify a point, if I may. If we're talking about a platform like YouTube, for example, or Facebook, or here, friends at Facebook, do we, the PROs already have a license. If it's UGC, if it's user-generated content, does it automatically fall under a YouTube or Facebook PRO license? And, you know, when does someone need to go to the PRO separately if they're streaming over those platforms versus fall under the UGC license of YouTube?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. In short, then yes, the social media platforms in general have their own licensing with the PROs that covers the user-generated content, as you mentioned. As far as when they would need to come to the PROs, if there's going to be you know, revenue that's being generated, you know, outside of that, then you should look deeper into what licensing would be required for that. So, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, that was an
Thanks, John.
excellent question. Excellent question. So let's move forward now to David Hirshland. David is currently the Executive Vice President of BMG, Music Publishing Catalogs, and he was formerly the President of Bug Music, and then it merged obviously with BMG in 2011. I had the wonderful pleasure of serving with David on the board of Folk Alliance International, and when I ended my presidency, I handed the baton to David. So he also served as president of Folk Alliance International for a couple of years there. It's good to see you here, David. Thank you for joining us. So the first question for you that comes up is, what are the publishers' concerns about the broadcast of concerts and the rebroadcast and live streaming?
Thanks, Renee, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody involved. Appreciate the opportunity. So if you think about publishing 101 or basic publishing, as John mentioned, if it's an audio only stream, there's no trigger for getting licenses from the publisher. The licensing issue arises when you synchronize the visual with the audio, and that's obviously going to be, I would think, 99% of these live streams, because that's what you're concerned with right now in this crazy era we're living through. So the various synchronization licenses come into play only if you are saving, if you will, rebroadcasting, hosting the performance on a website or other platform that would be viewable for people in the future. If you are simply broadcasting a performance in what we call a one and done, there is no need to come to a publisher and get a synchronization license. It's covered by the ephemeral exception of the Publishing Act, just as if you were showing on a newscast or something to that effect. So once you have your PRO license in place, and I'm going to assume that most venues would, then you do not need to go to a publisher.
David, can I interject one question here? So what is the time frame? You know, we live stream, but if you're going to rebroadcast, let's say you're going to put the show up to rebroadcast it, you're not going to leave it up, but you're going to leave it up. You're going to present the show during a certain time frame. When is the sync license triggered?
So it's generally, and honestly, I'm not even sure if this is in the copyright law, but we're looking at a 48-hour window. So any time within 2 days of the event, you do not need a license for the broadcast. If you exceed that time, obviously you're storing something, and you're going to show it a week or even 3 or 4 days later, then you technically need to go to the publishers and get a synchronization license. So, and then there's a lot of there's also then a lot of variables to this equation, because if you are hosting the performance on your website for a period of time, you need a synchronization license, and those terms have to be worked out. Publishers have to agree to the length of time, etc. If you are, YouTube was mentioned before. If you are simply making the live stream available on, say, you have a YouTube channel, as John mentioned, publishers have, almost all publishers anyway, have blanket licenses with YouTube. So you're covered if you're only using YouTube as a secondary source for the broadcast, for the webcast. So those are roughly the variables involved in needing a license.
So point of clarification, what you're saying is that even the sync license is covered if you're using a platform like YouTube or Facebook?
It's covered because we have blanket licenses. The publishers have blanket licenses. The caveat to that is not all publishers have those blanket licenses. So the challenge, unfortunately, is that for presenters is that they have to know who the publisher is for these compositions, just as they have to know, as John mentioned, they have to know who the PROs are. And I think the best resource for that is to go to the PRO websites, which has that information in one place.
Okay, so we go to the PRO website, we search who the publisher is. Who do we contact at the publisher to, is there a clearinghouse on the website that we can say, hey, we need to get a sync license for this?
Yeah, there generally is, and most publishers on their website, they'll have, synchronization inquiries, contact so-and-so. I think the more used to this everyone gets, the more relationships are going to be established at the publishers. But generally, if you send most publishers' websites are set up so that if you send a general inquiry, you'll get a response and be connected to a licensing representative.
It's a lot that we have to go through to be able to live stream or rebroadcast, isn't it?
Unfortunately, to rebroadcast, unfortunately, that's true. I mean, just the technicalities of the copyright law require it. I will say that for the most part, we're not charging much, if anything, for these licenses. So yes, there's some work involved, but there's really not much financial responsibility adding to the challenges you already have as a presenter. In publishing, a lot of our agreements are administration agreements, which means the owners of the copyright have control over how much we charge licensees. So oftentimes it'll be gratis. I mean, if a band is performing for a live stream and we handle their catalog, we'll just simply give you a gratis license, which is very easy to do. The complication comes in when there are songs which are controlled by publishers where their writers attached to them are expecting some sort of remuneration for that use.
Okay, I'm going to throw one more question out here because we have a little bit. It's one that's come up in quite a bit, which is, can you speak to those songs that are in the public domain? Are there still other permissions needed from estates, or is just open public domain? Can you speak a little bit to that? And
Yeah,
when that kicks in?
Yeah, well, public domain songs, yeah, there's no license required for a public domain song. You can use it for any purpose. Are you talking about the length of period, like when a song is in the public domain?
Yeah, it's 1923, and I think it just switched to 24, but
right,
yeah,
because it's a 95-year period in total for a song to fall into the public domain. And yeah, I think that's right. 1924, we may be up to 1925 now. I'm assuming that's going to be a rare. But yeah, obviously for classical or
classical.
Yeah.
That's where it comes in. So basically, the reason I was asking that is I know that there's been a lot of venues for whom they'll stick to, in the classical realm, it's a little easier to stick to where you don't need to worry about the licensing because you have that availability to do public domain. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Great. Anything else you want to add that you want to let us know at this point?
Well, I guess I'd add that we want to, publishers, at least, at BMG, we want to be as cooperative as as we can, because these are important, this is important exposure for our clients and our writers. So, unfortunately, the system is, it's not a one-stop shop system. We're working on that through the new Copyright Act and various other things. But for now, unfortunately, you have to do a little research and find out who you're dealing with on the publishing side.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm sure that there's going to be more questions for you at the end. So we're going to move forward to Alan Johnston, CEO of the Music Specialist, who is going to address some of our record company permissions that are required. Alan, so first question, what permissions are needed from the record labels in order to live stream or rebroadcast shows? And this is, of course, aside from licensing, just in publishing, just what is required on that end? Is Alan there? Is he unmuted? Alan, can you hear me?
Yes, when I unmute, it's so much better.
Great.
I take a different look because I'm not so corporate. I've been independent all of my career. And so the independent record labels are generally dealing with their own music that they've created, which should be under some type of authorization by the labels that created it, or the people that are working with them. Catalog is much different, and I think that's what we've been talking about here is catalog. If it's the music that's been done recently, within the last 20 years, metadata is critical. So the record labels need to make sure that they've got metadata placed on their product. We talk about, I tried to take a few notes here while you guys were talking. The independent owned material for record companies, there are not many of them that don't control the master rights and the publishing rights. If I'm correct, a lot of the people that are listening today are single duets, maybe trios tops, other than venue operators. And they keep control among themselves on what's going on. I don't know anyone that's currently going to research the songs before they play them. I don't know them as independent artists. They're even going on to Facebook this moment, right this second, and putting up on Facebook, we don't own the rights, and then playing anything they want to play, either old or new. I think the industry is in turmoil. And what I'm going to tell the listeners that want to know about record company labels is that if you control your own, then you can write your own contracts. You can tell who you want to distribute your stuff. We spoke, Renee and I, earlier about shows that were being recorded. And if the music in the shows that are being recorded is coming from independent musicians, they have the right at that moment to sign that sync licensing deal directly to the people that are shooting the show. The people that, independents, want exposure. So I'm saying that's some of the first.
Can you clarify? Can you clarify the term, how you're using the term independent musicians? Are you saying they're not signed with a PRO or a publisher?
See, here's the signing with, it's my understanding when you sign with a publisher, I'm sorry, with a performing rights organization, you basically are telling them to take over your rights and control them. But I don't see why you can't tell them, this is what I want to do with my song. I think there's two separate things happening there. Someone has to have control. And I believe the artist should have control of their product. I see John looking at me with his hand on his chin. He's saying, oh, wow, did he come with another? Yeah, yeah, but that's the way I see it, because there's so many people that are more interested in playing that music, making that song, getting that emotion to the next person.
Can I?
Those are the ones.
One of the things that you and I talked about that I think is a big interest to our constituents is the what needs to be in the recording contract to be able to utilize, for instance, name and likeness in in the future, because I think a lot of us have kind of a basic recording contract that was just okay, it's an archival recording, but what do we need to in the future protect ourselves to be able to rebroadcast later?
Now, are you asking from your company's point of view that has filmed something, or from the artist's point of view?
From the Performing Arts Center's point of view. We have now an artist, yeah.
So I took something from radio that was used up here. I'm in Atlanta, and V103 is the #1 radio station in this city. And we do several live events. They have a sign at the front door that basically says, any music played inside, anything filmed in here automatically becomes ours for usage 100%. If you step in, you agree to that. The artists then sign off. They agree that the radio station can film their performances and use their music and use the videos. That to me is a good deal. So I suggest that kind of situation for the performing rights system. The buildings themselves, the venues. I don't know too many venues that don't have some type of coverage. Now, we're talking differently the minute you start utilizing major catalogs. That's an entirely different story. Because the major catalogs will cut a deal with the venue. I don't even know if they still do that. Used to be a time the union guy would be in the room. Maybe I'm telling on my age. But the show couldn't start until the union guy said everything was all right.
Well, that is a very good segue because who we have coming up next, Neeta Ragoowansi, is the Business Development and Legal Affairs at NPREX and president of the Music Managers Forum. And we had a very good conversation the other day about platform and union permissions for live stream and rebroadcast. So I'm gonna ask Neeta now, once we do get, for a couple of things, let's start, I guess, with the platform permissions, but once we get the proper licenses, so how do we notify the platforms in order to not trigger the algorithms and have the concert taken down, or worse, if it's a live stream, to have it taken down in the middle of the live stream? What is your opinion on that?
Great question. I wanted to back up ever so slightly to address, because I was just seeing in the chat some questions that kind of
great. I can't see the chat, so that's great. I mean, I can see it.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the folks were sort of asking about what constitutes UGC, and John, you know, feel free to interrupt me here, and David. But if you're live streaming, let's talk about live stream versus rebroadcast and how we define rebroadcast, and then I'll go back to your question about whitelisting. So if you're creating user-generated content, that's kind of generally defined as something that's not commercial activity. So anything that really involves revenue, and it's defined broadly, would give you commercial activity. So for example, if you're doing a live stream and you're even asking for just a charitable donation, that sort of starts to trigger for a lot of folks in different territories. And, you know, we're talking about the United States, but we're also talking about the rest of the world. So if you're like in India, you know, if you're on YouTube and you're broadcast, live streaming everywhere, and it will trigger, if you're an artist doing a live stream or a theater or a venue asking for a donation, it may trigger commercial activity, which means you would need to go back to the publisher if you are going to capture, as David was saying, the recording and keep it on that platform. And David said, you know, rule of thumb for him is 48 hours. I think there's some other publishers who don't necessarily go with 48 hours. They might go with a shorter time frame. David, correct me if I'm wrong. But that there is still this idea that you would still have to go back to the publisher if you're on a platform such as YouTube. John, I mean, that is the understanding, right? You need to go back to the publisher to clear something that's considered commercial activity. So if you have a brand, for example, if you were working with Absolute Vodka and you say, hey, the first 100 folks, you know, who drop their email in a chat or a comment get a free bottle, even though you're the artist or the venue not getting the money, you're doing something, and that's considered a commercial activity, even if it's just promotional for a brand. So I just wanted to clear that up, just because we were sort of talking about that piece and folks were going, well, what is and is not UGC and when does it fall under it?
Thank you.
Going back to the whitelisting thing. So, okay, fine. You get a license a sync license from the publisher. If you have some sort of sound recording that's used, you get permission from the record label, and you have your piece up there, your video up there on YouTube, and you sit there and go, okay, how do I not get dinged as copyright infringement? How does the system behind YouTube, for example, the Content ID system, know that I've gotten permission? I'm good. And because a lot of folks have gotten these claims, basically, right, that say they're not allowed to, they're takedown notices, basically. And the way you do it is that the publisher, the actual copyright owner, whether it's a publisher or the label or both, need to whitelist you on their back end of their account, of their Content ID account, of their rights management system. So the whitelisting it's imperative to get that. I often, when I'm working with clients as a lawyer, I always try to make sure that the language is in the sync license agreement, or the language is in the master use agreement, so that you have it up front, that they are in fact obligated, they being the copyright owner, is obligated to go into their Content ID and put your channel, your YouTube channel, on the whitelist list. I mean, literally, if you're looking at an account for a publisher, for example, on their back-end account of YouTube, it is one of the pieces on the right, on the left-hand side, that says whitelist. They just have to click it. They have to put in the URL, well, not the full URL, but just the name of the channel. So if it's Kennedy Center, for example, on the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, they would just put that in, drop it into their whitelist, and it's whitelisted. The thing is, it's very broad. So if you did a sync license for 1 year for the United States only, you can't I don't think, go in and whitelist for 1 year for the United States only. Whitelist means whitelist. So the publisher has to remember, I got to go back in there in a year and take it off the whitelist if they've continued to use my video up there with my music in it beyond that. But that's more the concern of the publisher and the record label to, unfortunately, to have to police that, right? So, but of course, it's a good idea if you've only done a sync license for 1 year for US only, that you do your best as a licensee to abide by the terms of your license agreement. So mark your calendar, take it down in 1 year. Yeah, I think in short, that answers your question, Renee, right, about whitelisting. In the Facebook platform, there's a rights manager piece to that. That's a very similar type of thing. You go into rights manager as a publisher or a label. If you're the licensee, get it. If you didn't get it in your license agreement, you must go back and ask the publisher and the record label, but the publisher in the case of the compositions, to please whitelist so you don't get dinged and get that notice and get taken down off of YouTube.
So just to clarify, basically what you're saying is you have to go to the publisher and have them do their part to whitelist you, but you still have to go to Facebook or YouTube or whoever it is and let them know. You're saying there's a portion of it that you're going to go to.
No.
Okay, so just the publisher.
You only have to go to the publisher and ask the publisher to go into their account.
Okay, so then I'm just
add your channel to being a performing arts center, for example, to their whitelist, they being the publisher.
Got it. So I want to stick with you, Neeta, but I just want to throw to David, because you are the publisher. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes. In reality, though, let's talk practicality, because in reality, publishers cannot possibly track every single YouTube use and whether it's granted in the license or not. So the reality is, what will happen, and this is very, very rare, but what will happen is we'll get a takedown notice, and then YouTube doesn't immediately take down. They go to the publisher and they ask, is this something you want us to take down? At which point we will respond and say, no, we gave the license for this. So technically Neeta's right that, you should get the whitelist clause in the agreement, but we can't track every use. So I think that answers the question. But again, we'll respond. If there's a takedown notice, they come back to us. We find out we've got issued a license, and then we'll whitelist it at that point.
Different publishers will work different ways. There are lots of independent publishers I know who do sit there on the content ID system, hitting releases on claims and doing quick cut and paste for sync licenses they've done, and they're adding it in the back end. There are other publishers who just wait to hear and they don't do the proactive thing of whitelisting ahead of time. It's all across the board.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so rare. I think it's a very rare problem. So that's why we don't spend, we don't put all the resources into whitelisting everything we've got agreements for.
Wow, this is excellent information. Thank you so much. And so Neeta, thank you, David too. Neeta, moving forward, do you have anything else to add on that piece of it, or shall we move forward to union permissions?
We could move forward to union permissions, and then if we look at the question.
So can you speak to that? What is needed in union permissions for live stream and rebroadcast?
So the union permissions really let's look at the rebroadcast. There's a vast amount of issues here, but let's look at the rebroadcast. And I think we're defining that as, hey, I'm a theater, I'm a venue, I'm a performing arts center. We did a recording of a performance that happened in our space. I'm just laying up that factual scenario. We captured what was probably an archival recording, and we had permission under existing agreements when we to do an archival recording. And why I talk about those permissions is it's typically, let's say it's a musical theater piece in a performing arts center, because I keep getting this question a lot from the theaters out there and such. If you have a musical theater piece and you originally got your grand rights licenses from the copyright owners, and you have your agreements with Actors Equity for your actors, and you have your agreements with the director and the choreographer, all of the creative pool and the producers, etc. You're usually those agreements will have a right to make an archival recording of some sort. And it might be captured, though, at a theater that's a developmental theater, a theater that's kind of developing the musical on its way to Broadway. And the big question becomes, is the capture something that the director intended to be shown in public later? Is that really the final creative ideas? Typically, it's not. And so normally I would advise that if you're a venue, you have this great archival recording of a musical theater piece, that you go to the director first and say, and the author, and say, is this your creative vision, or is it good enough to put out there? Because if they say no, who cares about the unions? At that point, like you've stopped it in its tracks, because it's not just the unions. You have to get the director, the author, the various other folks involved in the creation of that piece to sign off on it as well. If there is an equity, say it has equity as one of the unions involved, and AF of M for the musicians, for the pit orchestra involved. A lot of theaters have done an equity agreement that speaks to the recording and potential future uses. And if it says, okay, later that gets put on PBS or put on Netflix, various sort of digital broadcasts, it will usually say, this now gets punted to the terms and conditions of the SAG-AFTRA agreement. And so there is something laid out. If you're a union house, you've done an Actors Equity agreement, there's probably something done that then says this punts over to SAG-AFTRA. So you look at a SAG-AFTRA agreement to get what your terms and conditions will be. And it typically requires some additional payment for this additional use. So it really is about looking at your existing deal from the time when you first did the creation of the performance to see what your future, to see if there's, if you want to then take that piece and put it up on a digital broadcast, we'll call it, a digital transmission, what your future requirements might be. AF of M, however, may not have had the local AF of M for that local venue or theater. You may not have had anything other than an agreement for that 6-week run of a musical, for example. And you will probably have to go back to AF of M and find, and they'll probably refer to a national agreement potentially, where they've laid out some additional terms and conditions. The thing is, a lot of this is so new. When I talk to sort of my theater lawyer friends out there, my colleagues, they're kind of shooting from the hip. They're kind of inventing this because there hasn't been, most folks who create archival recordings, it stays in the closet. You know, it was never really intended, and it's not necessarily even shot well enough to put out there. But in this day and age, when we're watching everyone perform from their living rooms, all of a sudden these recordings look really good. So folks are looking at their archives and going, I think we want to, you know, sort of engage our patrons and keep them engaged until we can have live performances again. And they are seeing a business out of this and they want to do it. So us lawyers are figuring it out as we go along as well. But it is about looking at original contracts. If you don't have it, you know, seeing if there's a union involved. If there's not a union involved in the first place, it becomes a bit of a tricky thing, because if you have, say, a jazz quartet or a jazz trio, and they performed in your venue, and now you want to go and take that archival recording and rebroadcast, you're going to need to go back to the artist, right? So let's say it's an independent artist, not affiliated to any one record label. They own their own masters. You would need to go back to the artist, and probably, unless you had it in your booking agreement that you're allowed to record, and then you had the right to use that recording in any and all media, you would still have to clear if the underlying musical composition with a sync license with David or his colleagues in the publishing world. But you would, but you'd also have to go back to the artist. If they're affiliated with a label and the label has a right to all their record, for the artist's future, I'm trying to remember the actual terminology, but their future activity, you may have to also get a clearance from the label as well. So the artist usually can tell you, but sometimes the artist doesn't. So it's good to ask, hey, artist, did you do a record deal? And does your record label have the right to have a yay or a nay when we are doing future, a broadcast of a past performance? So anyhow, you would, when you go back to that artist, a question you may want to ask is, are you a member of a union? It's a tricky area, but you might need to contact the AF of M for rebroadcast.
Thank you so much for that information, Neeta. We do appreciate it.
Sure.
We do have several questions that have come through on the Q&A, and we're at that point now. So I'm going to turn it over to some of the participants' questions that have been asked. One that has come up and actually was sent to us previously was, does it matter where the live stream is occurring from? In other words, so let's say somebody is live streaming from their home versus live streaming from a venue. What is the differences in licensing? Does it revert? Some people have asked, well, if it's live streaming from a venue for a venue, but I'm live streaming from home, does that take precedence? And how does that change what licensing is required? And I think you can determine whether that's a John question, or probably John, I would imagine, would be the best person to answer that one. How about you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sure. I'll take a swing at it first. You know, generally speaking, it doesn't necessarily matter where it's from. You know, either way, if it's going to be a stream, it's going to be a public performance. And, you know, to Renee's point earlier when I was on this topic, if it's being streamed over a social media platform, it's being streamed from somebody's home, then typically it's going to be user-generated content that those services are going to cover. If it's being streamed and it's on a separate site, separate stream, and it's, you know, there's money being involved, it's all these other issues that come up from it. then it's not necessarily, the point is not necessarily where the stream is originating from, but who owns it or who is generating that content.
Beautiful, thank you.
Just
So,
to pitch in for a second. So
sure.
if obviously if this is just a live performance, again, it's not there's no synchronization license needed. And if it goes from that person's house up to their YouTube channel, or as John said, it's UGC, then it's covered by our blanket license with YouTube. However, it is always subject to a takedown notice.
Ah, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. David, since you're here, there's another question that came for you. So with publishing rights that you have spoken about, would this require getting set lists from artists in advance of their performance to verify you've covered all the songs that are going to be played in the performance with all the publishers involved? Or do you assume that they'll be playing their typical catalog and not worry about it? So,
well, I think to be cautious, you would get a set list, or at least ask the artist whether they plan on playing any covers or not. Obviously, a lot of this stuff you're not going to know until the live stream is over, and at which point you're going to at which point if you are putting the content up on a platform for reviewing later, then you need to go get a license for those songs anyway. And to be realistic, you're not going to get a license prior to putting it up on your site, although that's a good idea. I mean, it's not always going to be timely.
okay, beautiful. So this is another question that came in earlier, which was, so what about the rebroadcast of others' shows? So specifically the question was, it says, our arts center is part of a retirement community, which has closed circuit TV channel that reaches 2,500 of our residents. We're looking at broadcasting concerts and performances for our residents. The movies are covered for a license, but concerts and other taped performances, such as ones at Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall, etc., are free. We offer free online, offered free online or not. How can we broadcast those other than searching for the right person at those organizations to grant us permission, or can we just automatically rebroadcast? And I don't know who would like to take a stab at that one.
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% confident, but I don't think it matters how big your audience is, unfortunately. Even though this seems like a very, beneficial thing for a retirement community, I think you're basically broadcasting program with copyright owner content, and you have to get the permission of that copyright owner to do so.
So even though they're rebroadcasting something that was already put out on a public performance, basically, they're going to have to get their own licensing or pursue it.
Correct.
Yeah, I think the issue comes in is that you are, in addition to the public performance, you've also got the recording of it. You also have the storing of it and the mechanicals, the synchronization of it. The public performance of it, sometimes that, the residential community or the apartment community or the retirement home as it is in this case, they may have a license that would cover certain public performances at that facility as well. So to I guess go back to David's point of what he was saying, you need to do your homework on it. You need to figure out exactly, okay, what are we going to be performing? Where is it going to be performed? And are the licenses in place from the content owners to have all those permissions covered?
Beautiful. Thank you. So Neeta, there's a question for you. It asks if you could address creating the agreements with platform and unions to live stream a specific performance from the get-go rather than doing this for an archival recording.
Right. So that is, it's funny because I sit there and go, it's the slew of everything that normally needs to get done right in the very beginning of creating anything. So if you're, sorry, this is for, yeah, I mean, I'm going to assume in this factual scenario, this is a live stream that would then get captured and kept up on, say, a YouTube channel, for example, right? Or the website of the Performing Arts Center, right? I mean, did they say in the question? Just remind me, Renee, did they say in the question? Oh,
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. No, it just says, can Neeta address creating the agreements with platform and unions? That's all. It just says, rather than doing this for an archival. Yeah, it didn't go into, yeah.
Right. Okay. So yeah, let's just assume it's creating something that is not just to be live streamed, but to be kept on a channel or on a website somewhere. One would have to, the union piece depends on if the performers and the people working on the show, someone in the chat said, don't forget IATSE, the stage hands and others who are also part of production. One has to see if all of the folks involved in the production are members of a union. And or if the venue itself is is a union house, has done collective bargaining agreements with the various unions. For those folks out there who have done that, they're going to know the answer to this one. So in a way, I'm like, you've spent oodles of money on labor lawyers to negotiate this, you know this. So yeah, I think it's for folks that probably where they're not using union members. If they're using union members, you got to go to the union and you need to say, this is what we're creating. How does this work? Because one might have to have a union agreement in place that covers everybody involved. If it's a, sorry, it was unions and platform agreements. And again, I mean, it's vague if we're talking about what platform. If we were talking about YouTube, it is about if you're just starting a channel and you expect there to be a lot of viewers because you're a large performing arts center, for example, it would be good to contact YouTube and be a partner and be in their partnership program so that you potentially may have the ability to have a higher percentage, potentially in there's a variety, that's a whole other subject for a whole other panel. But so you would want to work with YouTube and contact their YouTube partnership program or to have that agreement with them on what the rev share is. There's also third parties that are intermediaries between YouTube and yourself as a channel owner that you might want to consider, which are MCN multi-channel networks that you might want to be part of that, where they can maximize the ad revenue that is brought in on your channel. It's also a whole other topic, but it's something to look at. Sorry, Renee, you're on mute.
Thank you.
I hope that addresses it, but you would have to go to everybody involved again and get agreements with everyone as if you're starting from scratch.
Beautiful. Thank you. So now we have one last. Are there sources that presenters can be referred to or that may be shared with today's participants for contract language for presenting agreements? We're specifically looking for language for presenting agreement between presenter and artist for the live broadcast of live stream from our venue behind a paywall. Language that addresses current and future use of recording rights, royalties, who is responsible, etc. So who would like to address that?
They're asking, is there standard language?
Yes, and where to obtain that language. This is obviously, we're all in a new realm, and I think our previous agreements have not addressed this point of later on rebroadcast.
That's what I've been, as a lawyer, been doing for a variety of clients these past months, is redrafting all sorts of different agreements that come up. Nonprofits who had donor agreements where they would have sponsorships, that now say the sponsor wants to come on, instead of it being in a live space where normally you might have a sponsor who gets to introduce the artist at the beginning and do a quick shout out of their brand, for example. Now all of a sudden you have the sponsor on camera in a webinar type setting, right? Like speaking and then introducing an artist who then does a live stream from their living room. All of a sudden you need the okay from that sponsor, who's now talent in a sense on camera, because you want to now house that entire piece online. You actually have to go and get a clearance from it. So all of a sudden I'm adding the language of indemnification, intellectual property, that you rep and warrant that whatever you've said and done, or that you have the rights to say and do that. And that if we put your logo up, for example, that we have the right to use your logo for future recording. So there's an IP sort of paragraph that we add, and there's a indemnification that gets a little bit broader. But this is the work that us lawyers do, right? We have to chisel away and figure out the exact factual scenario of how this is being used. So I'm not an advocate for, legal Zoom on this one. There's not going to be standard language out there. It's about consulting an attorney. I just did a webinar yesterday for volunteer lawyers for the arts. If you don't have, they're being amazing during COVID. I mean, the one here in New York for volunteer lawyers for the arts has a music COVID initiative program where they're not charging a fee and lowering that financial need threshold so that a whole lot of folks can qualify to get pro bono legal services during this time period.
I'm finding
Renee,
also that the individual platforms all have different kind of situations happening also. Whatever you may have negotiated for a platform running out of Australia will be entirely different than the contract you'll have to negotiate for a platform running out of the Ukraine. And they both may be still live streaming the same artists from the United States. I totally agree with Nisha. It's first of all, there's no one spot on the line you can go get all the information at one place. Secondly, I found out in this business, you got to make friends. So you may need to go sit in a couple of these live streams from the attorneys and go meet somebody at BMG, or go talk to your publisher.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This webinar, we're kind of out of time now, unfortunately. It's clearly such a wonderful subject, and we have so much information that we could keep going on. I really thank you to all of the participants. We hope that everyone has found the ideas presented here useful to you. And we want to thank the Alliance for Performing Arts Conferences for presenting this webinar. Thank you to John Johnston, David Hirshland, Alan Johnston, and Neeta Ragoowansi. Please remember to click the chat box links to the resources and for future webinar offerings. This webinar will be made available as a recording on the APAP website and the Focal Lines International YouTube channel. So please stay safe, everybody. Stay connected to your community, and we will see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.